Hello everyone, thank you so much for coming. My name is Eli and I am going to talk to you today about how to authenticate your users over the web. In today's talk, we will cover what authentication actually is and why we need it, common ways to authenticate users and their pros and cons, and finally we'll talk about what makes an authentication system good and whether or not that's the same thing as it being secure. Spoiler alert, not exactly. So, first we have to ask, what is authentication? This thing that we hear so much about, it's so important. What actually is it and why do we need it? Well, let's say I have built a service that lives on the web without loss of generality, a web app of some kind. Ideally, I have at least one user. And this user will probably have some stuff, things like sensitive data or actions that only they should be able to perform, like posting under a given handle. As the person providing this web app to them, I want to be able to control these things. I'd like to be able to store their data, and I'd like to be able to control whether or not they are able to perform certain actions. Now, ideally, I have more than one user, and this presents a problem. I need to make sure that this person has access to their stuff, and only their stuff. In other words, as a web service provider, I would want to verify that a given user corresponds to a given identity, something I define, so that I can control their access to data and actions appropriately. So, how do we do it? It turns out identity is really hard to define, philosophically, let alone programmatically. So instead, we use abstractions, things you know, things you have, things you are. But these are abstractions and they can leak. They can only ever be approximate. We can have a look at some options for these kind of abstractions. We've got things like a username and password-based system, something you know. You can have access to an existing identity as a proxy for identity. You can have things that you are, biometrics. And you can have things that you have, for example, access to particular hardware with unique properties. And you can also have things like access to one-time passwords. This can all get a little bit overwhelming. So let's start by talking about one that hopefully will be familiar to everybody in this room, username and password. So what we do here is we have a web app, and this web app has some server code that runs somewhere securely. You can trust all the code that runs here. You have a client that runs untrusted code, and this is presented to the end user. And then you have your end user. If the user wants to authenticate, they put in their data, their username and password. The client then sends that to the server, and the server is able to verify that these pieces of data correspond to the identity the user is trying to claim. The server can then go back to the client, say, yep, this person is who they say they are, and then the user is authenticated. This is so far so familiar, right? In this world, we are assuming that knowledge of this password is equivalent to identity. That's the abstraction that is being used in this scenario. That means that if you know that password, you can assume that identity. So it's really important to keep track of who knows that password. Obviously, the user has to. And the client is easy. We don't have to store data. We can simply pass it through to the server. But the server is interesting, actually, because it doesn't have to know the password necessarily, but it does have to be able to verify that the password is correct. The server has the following responsibilities. It must be able to verify the password in order for our authentication to work, but it has to protect the password from being disclosed. In a naive world, we might store records like this. Username and password. Fantastic. The server gets the password, checks it against the records that it has. All is well and good. But then when our server is breached, all of these identities are immediately compromised. Fortunately, there is an answer to this, and it is hash functions. Hash functions are one-way functions that can take an input and produce a unique output. And what we have here is we have a sort of pseudocode thing where I'm putting in a password along with a bit of extra random data called salt. I'm plugging that into the hash function, and it gets some output that's a garbled string of characters. And that is what we store on the server along with the salt. So your records end up looking like this. This means that if your data is breached, if your server is breached, somebody who has this salted hash can no longer immediately just plug that back in and gain access to your identity. And you can see that it's stored the salt per user. So when the server receives the password, it can go, I need to add that salt, 7AF in this example, plug that into my hash function, and check that it matches the second half of what I've got stored there. However, this is still a little bit vulnerable because most people choose passwords that are easily memorable, made up of English words, for example. And given enough time and a sufficiently big computer, somebody with access to your salted hash can derive your password. There's a way around this too. It involves remembering passwords that look like this to begin with. So, we have now made password-based authentication pretty secure. All you need to do is remember as many passwords like this, don't reuse your passwords, for every service that you have. And this is why password-based authentication isn't the be-all and end-all, because users can forget their passwords. You have to be able to have some method of account recovery. Users can be tricked into giving away their password, and a type of attack called phishing. I want to go and log into my favorite online shop, but I typo the URL and I end up on one that looks exactly the same, and I put in my password and now somebody else has my password. And if I've reused that password elsewhere, all of those identities are also now compromised. So, how can we do better than this? Well, this is where the idea of multi-factor authentication comes in. And a multi-factor authentication is when you require more than one thing in order to verify that a user is who they say they are. In other words, we mitigate the risk of one abstraction failing by requiring multiple abstractions to succeed. So even if one leaks, hopefully 2 or more won't, all at the same time. Authentication factors can be things that you know, like a password. They can be things that you have, like access to specialized hardware. And they can be things that you are, like biometrics. This one is particularly interesting because the abstraction here is, well, my fingerprint genuinely is as good a proxy for identity as we have. But the abstraction is actually in turning that fingerprint into something a computer can understand. I have to trust my fingerprint scanner. That's where things can get a little bit dicey with biometrics. And if your biometric is compromised, it's a lot easier to get a new password than it is to get a new thumb. So when we require multiple authentication factors, we could require 2 things that you know. This isn't great, though, because if somebody's managed to compromise one secret that I know, they may well be able to use the exact same method to compromise a second thing that I know. So generally, when we do multi-factor authentication, it's best to mix them up. Something you know and something you have, or something you are, and this is superior. So, what are some options for multi-factor authentication? We are going to take a tour of other authentication factors, and I'm going to start with hardware authentication tokens. And I'm just going to grab my YubiKey. So hardware authentication tokens are things like a YubiKey, and they're also sometimes built into things like a platform authenticators that are built into your phone or your laptop. And to understand what they actually do, we have to know a little bit about public key cryptography. So basic primer, public key cryptography works by having key pairs, a private key that you keep to yourself and you never share, and a public key that you do share, and that's sort of your identity. And then, if I want to send some information to somebody that has my public key, I can use my private key to encrypt it. And the person who has my public key can use that key to decrypt and verify the message that I sent them. And then they know that it was me that sent it. So what hardware tokens do is they physically embody that private key, baked in at the hardware level. The way that you use them to authenticate looks like this. You've got the same setup, client, server, and user, or, you know. And I go to my web service and I say, I'd like to log in. And the client goes to the server and says, this person wants to log in. They have a hardware token associated with them. And the server says, OK, I'm going to make a request for their hardware token. The user then presents their hardware token, and that request from the server gets passed to it. The hardware token then does all the cryptographic processing necessary to confirm its identity, and sends that back to the client, who passes it through to the server, which uses its knowledge of your public key to verify that message, and then you can be authenticated. There are several quite interesting things about this flow. One of them is that the device knows about the web service that's making the authentication request. It's easy for me to typo a website and end up on something that looks very similar. I won't notice the difference, but my hardware token will, and it won't work if phishing attacks are rendered much, much less dangerous when you're using a hardware token. Another thing is that the private key never leaves the device. All the cryptography happens on the device itself. When you're dealing with platform authenticators, ones that are built into larger devices, there's actually a layer, a hardware layer, a sort of insulation. And what this means is that no matter if my computer is riddled with malware, nobody can extract that private key and get hold of that secret. Now, it would be possible, potentially, to brute force the private key out of a hardware token if your computer was, in fact, riddled with malware. And to protect against this, many hardware tokens, I think almost all, require user presence in order to do that cryptographic processing. So for hardware tokens that are like a YubiKey, that might be pressing a button. For ones built into a platform authenticator, they might require a biometric check. And this is where you'll see biometrics used in authentication. Mostly it's in order to activate a hardware token. So this is great, right? These completely solve security. What are the issues? Well, they're expensive. My YubiKey was 60 quid. Not prohibitive for somebody on a tech salary, but if you are going to require this of all the users of your web service, you have to be very sure that they'll be willing to do that. They can also be lost. These are physical objects. I have major ADHD. I am absolutely going to lose this at some point, and when I do, I'm going to need to be able to reset it everywhere that I have used it to verify my identity. Another option is one-time passwords. If you've ever received a text that looks like this, you'll be familiar. These are, well, they're passwords that work for one go. And you'll usually receive them by text or in an authenticator app on your smartphone. The way that this works is probably familiar to many people. You go to your web app and you say, I'd like to log in. The client says, cool, the server is going to go and generate you a code. That code gets sent to your device. You read that code and enter it. The client is able to verify it either by making another server call or in the browser directly, and you are authenticated. This is great. It means that you don't have to necessarily have an expensive hardware token in order to do a something you have method of authentication. It does rely on a couple of things. So if you're doing text-based authentication, you have to be pretty sure that nobody can clone your SIM and just also get your texts. This is a particular vulnerability that I think Reddit came a cropper of this, I think a few years ago, 2018, where they were using text-based multi-factor authentication, and somebody did this and gained access to administrator accounts. You can also lose your phone. You can also be in a place without phone signal. So it's not necessarily going to be accessible all of the time. I get absolutely garbage phone signal in my new house, and I will always ask for the two-factor authentication code via email instead. Speaking of email, there's another option, which is Magic Link Login. Slack uses this. Hands up who uses Slack. Yeah, you've almost certainly used this, and it looks like this. The way that this works is you go to your web app and you say, I'd like to log in. Here's who I am. And the client goes to the server and says, hey, please send an email to this person, including a link to an authenticated session. So including some kind of token that lives within the email. That gets sent. The user clicks on that link from their email and is taken to an authenticated session in the browser. Now, we have to assume that email communications are secure for this. That's a reasonably safe assumption. If somebody's cracked your Gmail, you probably have bigger things to worry about than whether or not your indie yarn shop is also at risk. And it's pretty good because most people have email accounts. And unlike phone signal, you can assume that if somebody's trying to log into your online service, they have an internet connection to check their email. However, you can lose access to email accounts. At work, we get a lot of people who are like, oh, I signed up with a student account and I've lost access. Can you transfer ownership or cancel it or any number of things? So you need to be able to handle that situation where somebody has lost access to the thing that we're using as a proxy for identity. So think about how many online accounts you have. Facebook, Google, Twitter, my online indie yarn shop, Tumblr, whatever. Think about setting up two-factor authentication for all of these. And then think about losing your YubiKey and having to go back and reset it everywhere that you've used it. Alternately, think about how many online accounts you use for work. Slack, GitHub, Jira, there's lots and lots of them, AWS, whatever. And think about being the sysadmin of a company with all those employees in it. you have to administrate all of those accounts for all of those employees and all of their authentication factors. That's a huge amount of overhead, and while MFA makes things more secure, sometimes that overhead will put people off. How can we do better? This is where the idea of single sign-on comes in. Single sign-on is the idea that you have one centrally managed identity, and you can use that in multiple places to authenticate. So in this world of single sign-on, we have two entities to consider: a service provider, this is my indie yarn shop, and an identity provider. This is something like Google or Okta. And what happens is that when I log in with my service provider, actually I'm using the identity provided by the identity provider. This has a lot of benefits. For example, I only have to set up multi-factor in one place and protect one account with it. If I lose my YubiKey, that's one place I have to reset it. If I want to update aspects of my identity, new card details, address, name change, that can happen in one place, and I can see all of those benefits and changes reflected across all of the services that I've used this identity with. So the way that it works abstractly is that I, as a user, go to my service provider and I say I'd like to log in. I'm then redirected to the identity provider, and I authenticate there with whatever means I've chosen. You can have strong authentication here, lots of multi-factor, everything that you want, your biometrics, your one-time passwords, the whole works. You're then logged in there, and the identity provider sends you back to your service provider with some kind of token of proof that the service provider can use somehow to verify that you are who you say you are and log you in there. This is a very high-level look. We'll look at frameworks in a moment. Now, there are quite a few benefits to this, not just as a user, but as a developer. It means, well, delegating authentication to a third party means a few things. You, as a web service, don't need to store user credentials. I don't need to worry about my indie yarn shop getting compromised because it never had to store authentication details. It delegated it all to Google. It means that you don't have to worry quite so much about what data you store and how you store it. Users don't need to remember lots of passwords. They need to remember their authentication details for one service. You can have one big, long, random string of characters that you remember, and that's all you need. There are some downsides. If your identity provider is compromised, everywhere that you've used that identity will also be compromised. It sort of seems a bit counterintuitive that putting all your eggs in one basket in this way can be more secure, but consider Google's security budget is a lot bigger than mine. We do see identity providers getting compromised. Okta had a breach earlier this year, but it's far less likely than a small web service provider with a small dev team who just aren't able to take into account all of the security considerations that a big identity provider is able to. So, how can we implement this lovely abstract idea? There are two mainstream methods that I'm going to talk about. One is SAML, which is Security Assertion Markup Language, and the other is OpenID Connect, often abbreviated to OIDC. So, let's talk about SAML. SAML uses XML data as its language for expressing authentication requests and assertions of identity. And the way that it works is you have a SAML service provider and a SAML identity provider. I, as a user, go to my SAML service provider. SAML is typically used these days in sort of enterprise situations. So let's say that this is my payroll system. I want to get my latest payslip. So I say I want to get my payslip. I need to log into the payroll system. I am then redirected in my browser to the identity provider. And that comes along with a SAML authentication request. This is a blob of XML data containing things like what method I need to use to authenticate, who I'm claiming to be. And this should all be cryptographically signed by a private key. The SAML identity provider has knowledge of the public key, is able to decrypt that XML data, parse it, understand who I'm trying to be, and what it needs to do to verify that, and I'm able to authenticate. I'm then redirected back in my browser, back to the service provider, along with an authentication assertion. This is another blob of XML data that contains things like, yes, this person authenticated at this time using this method. This is also cryptographically signed. The SAML service provider is able to decrypt and parse this data, use it to verify that I am who I say I am, and authenticate me. There are a few interesting things about this flow. One of them is that everything is happening in the browser with redirects and XML data attached. These two entities, the service provider and the identity provider, never talk to each other directly. That means that your identity provider can actually be closed from the public web. It could be running on a closed company network, for example. But you can be using the identity that it provides to authenticate with things that are on the public web. That's pretty cool. There are some downsides, though, and one of the big ones is that signing XML data is hard. Cryptographic signing happens over byte strings. XML is an incredibly permissive language. It allows you to express the same thing in multiple different ways. That makes signing it really hard. For an example of this, let's look at these two pieces of XML. You see the problem, right? These two things, they have the same semantic meaning. They mean the issuer in this piece of SAML data is whatever is in between these two tags. But if I were to sign these cryptographically, I would come out with two separate values. And that means that it could be parsed differently by people on the other end. What we need to do is we need to find some way of looking at these two pieces of SAML and extracting the semantic meaning of them. This process is called canonicalization. And canonicalization often includes the idea that you have extracted the semantic meaning and then recomposed it into a canonical form. Like, the way to say this thing in SAML is this particular blob of XML. Now, there's an issue with this. The issue with this is that in the SAML spec, there is not any one particular preferred canonicalization algorithm. There is, for a given language, there may be more than one implementation of a given algorithm. And your service provider and your identity provider are going to have to agree. If there's a mismatch in how they are understanding the XML data that's being passed between them, that's an avenue for an attacker to exploit. There have been SAML exploits that allow people to just log in as admin with absolutely no sort of authentication required. Basically, there's a kind of vulnerability baked into SAML by dint of the fact that it uses XML, this incredibly flexible and permissive language, provides an enormous attack surface. And this was the first type of SSO that we had. It was used sort of in corporations who basically ran into the problem of, my employees have all these accounts, how can I administrate them and centrally manage identity? And for a long time, it was good enough. Vulnerabilities appeared and were patched, and I'm not sure that there is a completely invulnerable SAML implementation out there, but it got the job done. However, if that had been all that we had, SSO might not have taken off as much as it has among the general population. This is where OpenID Connect comes in. And OpenID Connect is what you've probably used it if you've ever seen a screen that looks like this. And OpenID Connect is built on top of OAuth, which is an authorization framework, and it inherits some qualities from that framework. I'm not going to talk about authorization in this talk because it's an entire conference talk in its own right. But one of the things that you get from it is you have an identity server with multiple endpoints, and this turns out to be very useful for secure authentication. So the main differences between OIDC and SAML are as follows. OIDC uses JSON web tokens rather than XML to encrypt and transmit data and claims about who a person is and requests for that authentication. This is better because, while JSON web tokens have sort of various vulnerabilities, they are standardized in a way that XML data cannot be. There is a standard way of writing a given JSON web token, and there are golden paths for, like there are preferred canonicalization or preferred ways of cryptographically signing them. It is possible to set your it is possible to set your encryption algorithm to be none in a JSON web token. Don't recommend it. But there are standards that are widely adopted for signing JSON web tokens and being able to encrypt them securely, reliably, and have agreement between all parties as to what the data actually means in a way that isn't true for XML. Another thing is that the tokens that are passed back to the service provider are parsable by the service provider. They can extract data from them, but the service provider isn't responsible for verifying them. It can go back to the identity provider, directly communicating and say, hey, this token you've given me, is this legit? You know, or rather, I've been given this token. Can you tell me that this is legitimate? And this is a very strong defense against things like malicious tokens that are sort of injected somehow. The service provider has recourse to go back to the identity provider and double check. So the way that this login flow works is it's very similar, but there are obviously the differences that we just talked about. You'll notice that the OIDC authentication server is serving as the identity provider. So I've come to my web service. I want to log in. I am redirected in my browser to an authorization endpoint on the identity server. This is where I essentially authorize the identity server to let me log in with the service provider. So I do that using my multi-factor authentication. And then I am redirected back in my browser to the service provider along with an authorization code. And as a user, my point in the flow is now done. What the service provider now does is it takes that authorization code and goes back to the server to a different endpoint and says, I've been given this authorization code. This user has authorized me to log in on their behalf. Please, can you give me a token that I can use to understand who this user is? And the authentication server does so. It sends back an ID token. And this ID token, it's a bit of a misnomer to call it a token. That is what it's referred to in all of the documentation in the spec. Really what it is a record of authentication. That token says, this person authenticated with me at this time using this method. And that may be enough for the service provider to be confident logging you in. This can be the end of the login flow. But there's an optional step where the service provider can take that ID token and go to the introspection endpoint on the authentication server and say, hey, I have this token. Can you verify that this is real for me? And maybe I can have some more information about this person, something like an email address. That will depend on how you as the user have set up your identity with that authentication server as to what extra information is available to the service provider at this point. But basically, the service provider has a method by which it can look at a token that it's been given and have an extra step of trust and verification. And the OIDC server gets that token and can then tell you yes, and can tell the service provider, yes, this person did authenticate at this time, this is legitimate, and it can know this because of all of these tokens being cryptographically signed. And at this point, the service provider can be very confident in authenticating the user. So this is the kind of SSO that's taken over the world. It's what you end up like, there's multiple big identity providers like Google, Okta, you can use GitHub, you can log in with Twitter, and this is how all of those work. One of the really big benefits of SSO in general, but OIDC in particular, is that I, as a user, at any point can go to the authentication server, to my identity provider and say, hey, I don't want you to let this web service log in with this identity anymore. I want to turn off permissions for whatever web service. And that means you can actually revoke access to your identity to any service provider at any point. This is very useful if, for example, you want to stop using it. It's an extra layer of user control over how your identity is used. So we have now looked at a few different methods of authentication. We've gone through username and password, and we have gone through lots of different multiple authentication factor options like hardware tokens, one-time passwords, magic link login, and the various kinds of SSO. We are now ready to talk about what makes an authentication system good. So there's an obvious gimme right off the bat, security. If our authentication system isn't secure, then there's no point having it in the first place, right? You may as well just let everybody access everybody's details. To that end, I would invite us to take another look at our username and password example. Now, we discussed how this can actually be made technically secure. It involves you remembering lots of passwords like this. In fact, it involves you remembering lots of passwords like this. And password managers aside, use a password manager, protect it with 2FA. It can kind of be considered a type of SSO, but that is, again, a conference talk in and of itself, probably. This requirement on the user, in order to make this system secure, leads to insecure behaviors like password reuse, writing down passwords, simply adding a number that increments to the end of your password every place that you use it. All of the behaviors that people adopt when they're asked to rotate their password or to get a new password every 3 months. And this makes it insecure. Even though technically it's secure, the burden on the user makes it insecure. If something is hard to use securely, it's insecure. And I would caution against the idea that, I make a developer tool. All my users are developers. They're smart. They won't engage in these behaviors, right? My boss, smartest person I know, pasted his master password into Slack a few months ago. You can never rely on your users being perfect. Do not rely on this. It's simply not true. It's unfair to ask, and you'll end up building systems that are insecure as a result. So, if something is hard to use securely, that makes it insecure and compromises our first tenet of security. So I would argue that there is a second tenet here, and that is ease of use for your end users. Let's take another look at SAML. If implemented correctly and securely, which is theoretically possible, this is very user-friendly. It's SSO. It comes with all of the benefits that we know and love. Not having to remember multiple passwords, centralized identity management, and it is secure if you do it correctly. But, I could go on and on about the reasons why it is hard to do correctly. But this places an enormous burden on the developers to stay up to date in breaches in XML cryptography, to stay up to date with anything that's come up as issues in the libraries that you're using, to make sure that you cover all of your bases. And with the incredible attack surface that this method has, that's really, really hard. I don't know that anybody has ever written a completely secure SAML implementation. And this means that if something is hard to implement securely, it's insecure. Usability matters, not just for the users, but for us as developers. If we're taking on an enormous maintenance burden of a system, that's sort of a different kind of user friction. It's a friction that happens within the system and can cause it to break down over time if you don't maintain your systems. If those systems are hard to maintain and maintain securely, then you're going to end up with something that's insecure. So I would argue that there is a third pillar of what makes an authentication system good, and that is ease of implementation. Now, these three things might seem to be in conflict at various points, and that's probably true. We live in a world of trade-offs when we come to developing things. But I think that if you consider all of these at each stage, like design stage of how you're going to authenticate your users, you'll end up with a much better product at the end. So, for example, one-time passwords sent by text might have some security issues. The SIM cloning thing we talked about earlier. That doesn't make them worse than nothing at all. And if that is the thing that's going to be easiest to use for your users and easiest to implement for your developers, it might be the right choice. If you can find something that checks all three of these boxes completely, then congratulations, you found the Holy Grail. But I would argue that neglecting any one of these is going to lead to building something that is not secure and therefore not worth having. So, I am wrapping up way ahead of time, but we have talked about what authentication is and why you need it. We've talked about how we do it and the various pros and cons of various methods, why all of them are hard, actually, and how to do it well, and the fact that usability matters for us, for our users, and for the system as a whole. That wraps me up. Thank you so much for coming. I have a lot of time for questions. If anyone wants to ask me for more ranting about SAML, I have that in the bag.
Questions? I'm just going to bring the microphone in.
I can't see if people are holding up their hands, by the way. I'm sorry.
So what's your view on WebAuthn and how does it fit into the things?
Cool. So WebAuthn is a web standard that basically dictates how the use of hardware tokens should be expressed within a web framework. So the standards that define how hardware tokens work are called FIDO2. And there are two things that contribute to this. There's how the hardware should communicate with the system it's plugged into. Like, what goes on when I plug this YubiKey in and what's the data transmission there? That's called CTAP. I forget what it stands for. And then how that data that's then on your computer, your OS, whatever, how that should interact with the web, that's WebAuthn. So WebAuthn defines if my web service is going to ask for a hardware token, how does it do that? What's the language? What can it ask for? What can it assume? And so those two standards together basically mean that you can trust that your hardware token and your web service are going to play nicely together. That's what FIDO2 is, and that's why you'll see keys being described as FIDO2 compliant. So that is part of the hardware token stuff. It's really, really cool because it basically means that your web service can basically have its behavior, and that behavior can be guaranteed to work with any kind of hardware token, because it's not just YubiKey, there are multiple manufacturers. And it basically it's a really well-defined API that anybody who's building either a web service or designing a hardware token needs to meet. Does that answer that question?
Just take this question at the back here.
When I go to some publisher's website and they want me to sign in with, say, Google or Facebook, and I click the button, I then get sent off to Google, who knows a lot about me, and then they take a bunch of stuff which I can't necessarily see much about because it's encrypted, and send it back to this publisher who hopefully doesn't know a whole heap about me. What is there anything in play that would help the user to get some visibility into what that data looks like or how much is being shared about them?
Yeah, so this is where we get into the sort of distinction between authentication and authorization. So basically, when you use OIDC, there's a sort of limited amount of data that gets sent about you to the web service. And ideally, when you go to your web service, so your identity provider, you should be able to control that. I haven't actually been in the Google settings and say, hey, when I log in with so-and-so, do they have access to my emails? Do they have access to this, that, the other? That's one of the things sometimes you'll see services say, oh, this service wants to access your photos in your Google Drive, in your Google Cloud or whatever. And whether or not web services are authorized to use those pieces of data about you is more of an OAuth thing than an OIDC thing. It's really complicated is the answer, but in an ideal world, you would be able to go to your identity provider and actually see that data as a user. It may not be in Google's best interests to allow you to do that, but in a sort of in an ideal world where they don't profit off of our data quite as much as they do, that might be more possible. I'm not saying it's not possible. I don't know. Yeah. It's a bit of a grey area, basically, and it's because of the fact that OIDC is built on top of this authorization framework, which is a much more complex and kind of finely grained thing than just authentication. Sorry, that's very rambling. I don't know if it answers your question exactly, but yeah.
Thanks very much for the presentation. I heard that, or I thought I read a couple of months back that both Apple and Google, through their Android platform, were looking at trying to sort of implement WebAuthn into the phones or the platforms going forward, so that at some point it's available as an option. And I didn't quite understand how, like whether the FIDO2 and WebAuthn, whether that was possible, or whether really it's only possible on the YubiKey or a similar hardware token, or whether, I'm just interested in your view as to whether you think it's possible, because it occurs to me, look, everyone's got a phone just about. If that does happen and they roll it out, and it's a standard feature of all phones, does that get us down the pathway of solving this problem?
Yes. So I've noticed Phil looking excited. I believe his talk touches on very similar things. So go to his talk. He's the expert on this. As you say, hardware tokens are now a normal feature of many, many devices, smartphones primary among them. I think my understanding of the proposal here is that instead of, like, I have a password for my Google account, that is the primary authentication factor, is this thing that I know, and then having a hardware token or a mobile number associated is the secondary authentication factor. My understanding is that they want to flip it so that ownership of a hardware token, probably within a phone on a Google OS, becomes the primary secret that identifies you. And from there, you don't need a password, you just need physical access to your phone. I'm just having a horrible flashback to the time that I dropped my phone in the middle of the road and it got run over multiple times. That's my fear about that. So I think, obviously, this is something that anybody designing these systems will have thought about, and will have had ways to think about how to mitigate the problems. You know, the equivalent problem of forgetting your password is losing physical access to this thing. I think it could be really interesting because it would change a lot of the ways that sort of phishing attacks and various cyber attacks have to be conceived. So.
So what they built into that was syncing to your kind of platform account as well, so that the platform authenticator allows you to sync your tokens across to your account. So if you drop your phone, if you're your Android phone, it's still able to sync back from a Google account at some point. If you drop your iPhone, you can sync it back from your iCloud. And same for Windows. So again, it does tie things very much to an account there, but on the other hand, it makes life a little easier and doesn't get lost. Doesn't get horribly lost.
I mean, on the topic of keys getting lost, I did a podcast episode of .NET Rocks back in recorded at NDC London this past year, and one of the things I spoke about with Rich Campbell at that point was he has multiple YubiKeys, and he's got this great system for if he loses one, knowing which one it is and being able to back it up and having multiple hardware tokens registered to a single account. And that's a really clever way, I think, of mitigating that particular failure mode to which I am extremely prone. Yeah, does that answer your question? I mean, I think the real answer is going to be go to Phil's talk.
I'll just bring the microphone up. Just on the left first.
Thanks. Continuing on the topic of hardware tokens, presumably the computer that you're accessing the website from needs to have some sort of driver installed so that the hardware token works. Is that ever a problem if you, say, are logging in from like a public library computer or something that's really locked down?
I would assume not. I think that's the domain of what CTAP is there to mandate. That's what that sort of standard is there to ensure, that the idea that whatever computer you are accessing, you're sort of using as a pass-through, is able to handle that communication. There may well be computers that aren't CTAP compliant, I guess. One interesting thing about it is that obviously you can have YubiKeys. I think this one has NFC on it. There are various modes of transport that are defined within CTAP, so you can have Bluetooth and NFC and then physical USB connection. And there are different requirements for how that data is transferred. Yeah, I think it's entirely possible that there are computers that are not CTAP compliant, but I would imagine that the designing of that spec was done to be as permissive as possible to various types of computers. Because essentially they're just like C structs that get passed back and forth. And the schema of all of those is what's defined in CTAP. Yeah, that's very interesting. I want to go away and look that up now.
So can I ask a question to this room, given about think about authentication providers, and is that on my company we got kind of badly burnt by one of the authentication providers when they all of a sudden upped the price a few hundred times.
Yep.
And so what I'm wondering is how many people here have implemented their own identity service provider, like identity server, versus how many are buying the service like Auth0 or all the other ones that are out there. So raise your hands if you're using your own implementation.
Oh, using, no.
or yeah, or if your company or your product are using. Now, how many are buying that service? Yeah. Thank you very much for that.
Yeah. I've implemented one as a toy. I certainly wouldn't use it for anything I cared about.
It is a lot of work to implement your own.
I think
Let me
most
show
of
you.
the people that will be rolling their own are going to be SAML service providers, and there's slightly less risk in that if you are using it on a closed company network, because you have a much stricter control over who is able to access that, because if it's behind a VPN or something. And because SAML doesn't require the two entities to directly communicate, you can do that, but you have to use SAML.
Yeah, and you're talking about SAML really scares me because we have some of our bigger clients are enforcing it upon our identity service, which is a pure OIDC service.
Yeah, I mean, what I
So
haven't really talked about in this talk is I work for Anvil, and we are a platform for developing web apps, and as such, we have a lot of built-in user authentication options. SAML we have as a business plan thing only, and we rarely see people using it except in enterprise. But yeah, when it's a requirement, sometimes it's a hard requirement,
Yep.
unfortunately.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good to know.
Just coming from the logout perspective of this, so when you have single identity providers, the organization uses one, and then customers log into different applications, and then they decide to log out from one application. And for example, our organization has policy that they have to remain logged in into the identity provider, and maybe re-authenticate them once a month. But that to me leads into like it's a compromise, I guess, between security and ease of use, right? Like,
It often is. That's often what it comes down to.
What's the best practice, or like?
Be as secure as you possibly can, as long as your users will tolerate it. I mean, if it takes me a fingerprint scan and a one-time password and 3 different big long strings of characters and a face scan and a retinal scan to get into my bank account, I'm going to start keeping my money in my mattress, which, let's be honest, with the UK economy. So, you know, yes, with things where you require a lot of your users, you have to decide whether or not that burden is going to be too much for them. With the logout thing, one of the things with OIDC is that you can go into your account and say, I want to revoke access for Pinterest or whatever. With SAML, that would be per identity provider implementation. If you're rolling your own, you're going to have to implement being able to log out. There is a SAML logout request. It's maybe one of the more cursed bits of the SAML spec. I read that bit and I was like, I'm not even going to try and cover this. It's too far down the rabbit hole. There are ways to do granular logout. I think OADC has a pretty good method of doing that, things like revoking access tokens and so on. And that's the point at where the callback between the service provider and the identity provider will come into play, because the service provider will go, look, I've got this token. Can you tell me who this is? And the identity provider will go, oh, that's not valid anymore. Which is one of the strengths of having those two entities be able to directly communicate, which is obviously something that SAML lacks, both a blessing and a curse. Yeah, I mean, you have your constraints of whatever business needs you have, as well as security and ease of use needs that you have, and you kind of have to, make the best choice that you can under your constraints, which I think is probably the hardest problem in software engineering, apart from naming, cache invalidation, and off by 1 errors. So I missed an integral part of that joke, the 2 hardest things. Yes.
Just let me bring the mic over.
Oh, yeah,
Sorry.
yeah, Mike. Yeah, it's okay.
Just for the remote online.
I'm all mic'd up, I forget that everyone else isn't.
Has anyone done a SAML token using JOTs, JDOTs?
Oh, well, I mean,
So it gets rid of
SAML,
some of the
I
weaknesses.
don't think it would be SAML anymore, because it's security assertion markup language, which is an extension to XML. It's kind of, that's the whole deal, is that you're using this SAML language to express your things. So SAML with JOTs, I think, would be better than SAML with XML, because of the golden paths of encrypting them and sort of standardization of the ways that things are expressed within them. That would be a sort of halfway house between the two, the SAML and OIDC, but then you wouldn't get the being able to call between the two entities directly for extra verification. But you would preserve the ability to have your identity provider offline. Maybe for some people that's the right approach. It involves definitely rolling your own. I don't know any of the off-the-shelf solution for that. I won't be offended if there aren't more questions. Don't worry.
Looks like that may be it.
Cool. All right, well, thank you so much for coming. It's been a pleasure.